All right, we're here. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thanks so much for joining us on a Friday. Josh Doring, Chris Brown, they are here with me. Josh Doring in his box on the screen, Chris Brown on his. Gentlemen, how you doing this morning?
Carson Wentz got traded, so I'm sad and happy.
We're about to unpack that. We're about to unpack that in a big way. Chris, how you doing?
Doing all right. Fernando Tatis signed a big contract, so I'm just happy, no sad, just happy.
and we'll get to that as well. We got a lot to break down today. Carson Wentz going to the Colts. We talked about this on, was that Monday that we talked about this, or a week ago? I think it was Monday that we talked about.
Yeah, we talked about
possible places for Wentz and J.J. Watt. As far as I know, J.J. Watt doesn't have a new home yet, but Carson Wentz does, back with Frank Reich in Indianapolis. We'll get to that here in just a moment. We're going to do Humor Me Please in the middle of the show, and then best, most interesting of the weekend to round out 110 Daily on a Friday, and then get going towards the weekend. But Josh, I feel like it's only appropriate that we start with you here. You're an avid Carson Wentz. You apologize for Carson Wentz. You defend Carson Wentz.
I'm a proud Carson Wentz apologist.
And you are, in some ways, you might be Carson Wentz's biggest fan. In some ways. I mean, let me put it this way. I certainly have not... I don't know anybody else who has continued to go to bat for Carson Wentz when, let's be honest, there aren't a whole lot of reasons to go to bat for Carson Wentz. But now he's an Indianapolis Colt. He's no longer in Philly. He's back with Frank Reich. All of these things seem like good things. What say you about Carson Wentz's new chapter?
Well, first, I got to say there's at least one person that's a bigger Carson Wentz fan than me. And that's Dan Orlovsky, because Dan Orlovsky said he needs to be in the MVP conversation now that he got traded to the Colts, and I'm not willing to go that far. I can't in good conscience say I'm a bigger Carson Wentz supporter than Dan Orlovsky.
That's fair. I appreciate that. Appreciate that transparency.
But I'm generally in agreement with his sentiment that he is shareable on vacation in Disney World, which is a funny part of all of this to me. But this is a win for everybody in the context of this situation. It's an awful look for the Eagles that you're eating $34 million of dead cap money to get rid of the guy who was supposed to be your franchise quarterback who didn't want to be there anymore and apparently didn't talk to your head coach for half of last season. Got that report coming out this morning. But considering the situation you were in, you get a third rounder and this conditional pick in 2022, which either you get a second and a third for a guy who you would have to feel like you made the right decision because that means he's not playing for the Colts, whether that's poor performance or injury, or you get a first rounder because he is playing for the Colts and he meets this criteria that moves it from a second rounder to a first rounder. I was surprised that the Colts gave up as much as they did, considering Chris Ballard, the leverage they had, and the fact that Carson Wentz just didn't seem interested in going to the Bears, so they were basically bidding against themselves. I thought the Eagles did a good job getting what they could out of this. I didn't think the return would be as significant as it is. Now, if Wentz goes back to being 2017 or 2019 version Wentz, of course this is not fair market value. But considering that you're trying to get somebody to take your quarterback who is as bad as any in the NFL last season, you did a pretty good job if you're Howie Roseman. Mm-hmm. From the Colts standpoint, you don't have a lot of options available. Of course, there's the relationship aspect of this and the fact that Frank Reich was there overseeing Carson Wentz's best season, and he really likes Press Taylor, who Reich brought in to work with this offensive staff. But I guess the place I'll start is they obviously needed a quarterback. They needed to figure something out. And this roster looks an awful lot like the one that the Eagles won the Super Bowl with in 2017. You have a defensive all-pro, and I would call Darius Leonard a superstar. I wouldn't go that far with Malcolm Jenkins, but that emotional leader, the guy who is the best player on your defense, the heartbeat, the sort of the driving force, some good defensive linemen. You're okay in the secondary. It's a really good defense. And then you've got some weapons on offense. not a bunch of stars, not elite receivers, but guys that you trust that are good football players and only getting better when you're talking about Jonathan Taylor and
I was
Michael
about to
Pittman and
say
these guys.
you might have 2 stars on that team
Right.
in a couple of years.
Yeah, right. That's the other part of this is they're not Alshon Jeffries, established veterans. They're young guys who are only getting better, plus a really, really good offensive line.
Yeah.
That's basically the formula Carson Wentz looked like an MVP with. This, if you get 2019 Wentz, because 2017 Wentz might not ever happen again. That is not, that was above and beyond what Carson Wentz is. That was the best he's going to play in his career. I'm convinced of that. But if you get 2019 Wentz, this is a Super Bowl contender. He raises your ceiling that much. The question is, are you getting that quarterback? Because it's sort of two different questions here. I think this is sort of where I come down on this. Are the Colts Super Bowl contenders versus can the Colts be Super Bowl contenders? They absolutely can be, but you can't say they are because we don't know what Wentz is going to look like.
Yeah, only because of what you just said. Are they not Super Bowl contenders? Because on the surface, this roster is a Super Bowl contending roster.
Right. If you get a top 10 quarterback, which is what Wentz is from a talent standpoint and has been for most of his career. Right, this is a Super Bowl contender. Absolutely.
Because he doesn't have to be all that much better than Phillip Rivers was for them to truly be Super Bowl contenders. They lost to the Bills by 3. If you lose to the Bills by if you lose to the Bills by 3 and you're one of the 4 teams left in your conference at the end of the year in the divisional round, you're getting to a point where you're a Super Bowl contender, right? If you're one of the 8 teams left in the playoffs, right? This particular year, it was the Bills and Chiefs in the AFC ahead of the Colts, and there, nobody was going to bat for the Colts being the favorite to come out of the AFC, right? But we're talking about he doesn't have to be to. It's not like he has to be 2017 Carson Wentz for this Colts team to really truly be a contender. He just needs to be better than Phillip Rivers was, and to scare people a little bit more than Phillip Rivers did. And Phillip Rivers had a good season, but one that was better than I thought it would be, to be clear. But the thing that I love about this so much for Carson Wentz is that he gets to come in to a football team that, even if he's just not good, still probably goes 9-7, 8-8, right? Even if he's just downright horrible, there's enough talent on this offense and a high quality defense so the point being is that the pressure's not all on his shoulders, and there are guys on this football team that are used to the pressure being on their shoulders, whether it's specifically that defense being sort of the focal point of the Colts the last few years. That's a perfect spot for somebody who's really needs to come in and first and foremost regain his confidence. And I think to a certain extent that just happens because he's going to a team that traded for him, right? And going to a team that, by definition, if you trade for somebody, you at least have some faith in them. And there's Frank Reich, and it's just a better situation. So I think before he even steps on the football field in an actual game in September, there will be some confidence back there that was completely gone by the time his time in Philly was clearly coming to an end.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's certainly, I'm certainly in agreement with you on that point. I guess I'll start by saying, I kind of come around to that that area in a second. I guess I'll start by sort of addressing with the Eagles side. One thing I kind of noticed yesterday, and I think about this every time there's a sort of a big trade like this, is everybody likes to give out trade grades, right? Like that's just a big thing, and I understand it because it's fun, it's easy to digest and think about, and you want to do it to assess the teams. But it's so tricky when I think of the Eagles side, because if I look at the specific circumstances of where they are in the situation they were in and just said, here, I'm going to plop you down in those circumstances, make the best of it. Well, then maybe I give them a B or something like that.
Yep.
But it also sort of is misleading because it's sort of like, the Eagles get a B, and I might give the Colts like a B as well, or a B minus, or an A or a B plus or something. And it sort of makes it seem like these two sides are like, oh, well, they both got a B. And it's like, yeah, but the Eagles helped get themselves into this situation in the first place, right? It's not as if the context that I'm dropping them into is saying, well, given the context, you get a B, but you also put yourself in these circumstances. So it's not like it's a B for the Carson Wentz experience in Philadelphia, because obviously nobody would want to give it anything like that. So it's always one of those things I'm trying to keep in mind as I, think about these things. Obviously, it didn't end up being a very much a Stafford-like deal, which of course the Eagles had their sights set high, which of course they're going to, you know. And I think it's really important to remember from the Colts side the situation they were in, because like you guys have said, this is a really good team. This is a very well-rounded team in literally every other way except for not every other way, but except for the quarterback position. It's a team that you look around and you say, this is a top 10 defense. This is a great offensive line that can protect a quarterback. You look and you say, all they need is a good quarterback, not an elite quarterback. Like you guys said, he doesn't have to get back to 2017 Carson Wentz. But they were in a situation where they were in need of a quarterback right now. They're picking it number 21 in the upcoming draft. That's not going to move. They're not going to be able to get a quarterback there who's a needle mover. How many appealing free agent options are there out there? Aside from prying away Deshaun Watson from the Texans, which, who knows what the odds of that even are anyway.
Especially in the division.
Mm-hmm. Right, especially in the division. What else are they going to do? Like, they were in a spot where, like, other teams would have panicked. And I think at the end of the day, Chris Ballard didn't bid against himself. Yeah, he gave up a good amount. Like, it's certainly, which is why I would give, in a vacuum, I'm giving, in the circumstances, I'd give the Eagles a B, because, yeah, that is a solid return.
Mm-hmm. But it's still not an outright first-round pick.
But it's still not an outright first-round pick. And if Wentz is good enough, if he plays 70% of their snaps, let's say, and they reach the playoffs, then nobody in Indianapolis is going to care about them getting a first-round pick. Mm-hmm. That isn't going to be that good of a first-round pick anyway, because they made the playoffs, right? It's not going to be, nobody's going to care. And so, right, obviously there's some risk, but you have to believe that Frank Reich was involved in this process heavily, and that the Colts front office, Chris Bauer, Jim Irsay, they believe that Frank Reich's voice carries a large amount of weight to them. I'm very confident in saying that. And so I have to believe that Frank Reich is confident that he can get at least 2017, not 2017, at least a good version of Carson Wentz back. One thing I'm curious about is, because we've talked about Carson Wentz, maybe getting back to 2019 version versus 2017 version. Well, Carson Wentz's 2019 season, his QBR was basically identical to Phillip Rivers' 2020 season. Now, I think that some people pointed that out and be like, well, how much better is he? If he gets back to 2019 version, that's not that much better than Phillip Rivers. I think it's also, you have to consider the circumstances, because that's an oversimplification of the process, because the Eagles were not, like, the Colts supporting cast in 2020 was so much better than the Eagles supporting cast. They were just, that offensive line was so banged up, right, Josh?
Yeah, this is the other point I wanted to bring up, so I'm glad you went there anyway. And the other part of this too, right? You talked about it's weird to grade this because you grade the transaction itself in the circumstances, and then the bigger picture of, in the span of one season, you went from this guy being your franchise quarterback to him asking to be traded because he got benched and was awful. Mm-hmm. And there's that part of it. There's also the other side of this, which is, how in the world are you supposed to grade this trade when we don't know what Carson Wentz in a Colts uniform looks like? If Carson Wentz comes back to being his best, and Frank Reich, for whatever reason, just makes it work because they have this bond and he knows how to work with them, then this is a terrible trade for the Eagles. They're going to look silly. They gave up a franchise quarterback who could very easily end up with a Super Bowl and being one of the best Colts quarterbacks of all time.
Now, part of it is, if they can't get that, if they can't get that out of him, though, then how, like, even if he does go on to do that with the Colts, I'm not disagreeing, but even if he does go on to, not that, but even if he's great with the Colts, that doesn't mean that they could have gotten that out of him, though. That the Eagles,
and that's fair, right? And I'm just saying, absolute best case scenario for the Colts, right? He wins a Super Bowl and is on that second level behind Peyton Manning or something.
Thank you for the clarification there.
Yeah. I'm not saying the best. I'm saying outside of Peyton Manning, you got some wiggle room. Sure. But the other side of this is, if it doesn't work in Indy, it was never going to work anywhere, because this is set up for him to succeed on every level. coaching staff, roster, all of that.
Culture.
In which,
too.
Right, everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In which case, you look really good because you got a second and maybe or a third and maybe a first or either a first or a second for a quarterback who was bad, didn't get any better, and you got off the hook for paying him. So it could go so many different directions. That's the other strange part of this. To the numbers, because I've seen people making these comparisons to Philip Rivers. I refuse to actually look at stats and compare Carson Wentz to other quarterbacks. Because, and I know that sounds sort of silly, but this is what I mean by it. Right. That 2019 team, he was throwing to scouting team dudes, practice squad guys, and got him to the playoffs. This is the opposite of Matthew Stafford in a sense, right? Where Matthew Stafford always puts up the numbers, but he doesn't play in the big games because his team is never good enough. And even when he plays well, right, he's not enough to elevate the team by himself. Carson Wentz did that in 2019. Were the numbers beautiful? No, they were good. They weren't mind-blowing because he was throwing to guys you didn't know what their names were. And right, there was some offensive line. They were so banged up, I couldn't tell you who was out there. That's the other part of this, is that Philip Rivers, even going back to San Diego at the end there, he had a Keenan Allen. And then you had Jonathan Taylor and all these different weapons that they have now. That's the part of this that we just don't know. It's been a roller coaster with Wentz. He was terrific in 2017. He was good in 8. He was fine in 18. I thought he was really good in 19, and then obviously awful this season. But the context of this is so important because the other part of this, I can sort of flip it and say, you want to know how valuable Carson Wentz was to the Eagles? He basically took the same roster that went 4-12 this season when he was awful and they didn't have good quarterback play and took them to the playoffs. Now, it was the NFC East, I get it. But they still went into Dallas and beat the Cowboys and got there. I can't remember if that game was in Dallas. But he beat the Cowboys to win the division with essentially the same roster. Yeah, there were a couple differences. That's how valuable he was. They went from being one of the worst teams in the NFL to being a playoff team based on his much improved the opposite of the decrease of performance he had this season. That's the part of this that nobody's talking about too. So I don't care about the numbers. Give him a real team, a real offensive line, real weapons, a real running game, and a franchise that's invested in him, and let's see what happens. He's got no excuses. I fully acknowledge that. If it doesn't work in Indy, it's not going to work. He wanted out. He got his spot. This is on Carson Wentz now. He needs to step up. He needs to take care of his business on and off the field and show up and just fit right in because they've got a good thing going. That culture is there. He needs to just go with it and buy into what is already happening and not try and impose his will on this team.
Because while all of what you just said is true, what's also true is that this is a guy who got drafted 5 years ago with the number 2 overall pick, and he's on a different football team now. And when he was playing poorly, he was blaming everybody else but himself. And while that is, and we're dropping a ton of frames here, so hopefully it'll fix itself here in a moment. But while all of what you just said is true, it is certainly fair to, at least to a certain extent, be skeptical, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because, right, in a perfect world, right, let me put it this way. I was surprised by the way Carson Wentz reacted to him not playing well. I thought he would have a different reaction to that. What I need from him in Indy is kind of what I need from my owners. I need to not hear from him. I need to see him on the football field and not hear from him except for when something happens that we need to hear from him. Whether it's in the press conference you're saying the right thing because you lost to the Lions inexplicably, right? Or some, or and owning, if he has a bad game and it results in them losing to a team they shouldn't, that he's stepping up in the press conference and taking responsibility. But other than that, like you said, fit in, don't disrupt things any more than bringing a new quarterback in disrupts things. And not just for the sake of the Colts, but for the sake of him, because I also think that's right. He got stripped of weapons and real NFL football players in Philly. But, I mean, the culture in Philly was in shambles by the time he left. Part of that is his fault. Part of that is his fault, but also part of that is just, my point being is that when he thrived, there wasn't many football teams in the NFL that had better culture. I mean, Nick Foles was able to come in and win a Super Bowl. Part of that is talent, but part of that is culture and being able to put somebody in that spot and setting him up for success because of the way you're running things. I think the Colts have the foundation of that as well. It's his job to make sure he doesn't mess that up, because he's been a part of culture being messed up in Philly. Even if it wasn't completely his fault, there were definitely things that he could have handled better.
Do you have more, Chris? I've got a couple quick responses, but I didn't want to.
Oh, I've just got a fun stat. I'll just say it real quick and then I'll let you respond. Well, no, you respond. I'll give the stat at the end. It's
Okay.
not really related to him as much as just overall stuff.
All right, yeah. Spot on. And I will continue to argue that Nick Foles was a massive reason why that culture in Philly existed. That's the part that doesn't get talked about. Before he was playing, bringing him back into that locker room was absolutely vital because of everything that he does from that standpoint, from the leadership side of things.
Sure.
Yeah. It's a weird sort of situation here. I will say, in Wentz's defense, by and large, he was saying the right things, I feel like, in press conferences after games when he was playing. Whether or not it actually translated into his actions and the way he carried himself, who knows? It didn't seem to go over all that well with his teammates. But he didn't sort of publicly come out and throw anybody under the bus. He said a lot of, I got to take care of the ball, I got to make better decisions, and then proceeded to not do those things. But the larger concern for me is what happened after and the way he responded to the benching and the fact that he basically just went dark.
Yeah. That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. So, because I think I'm not comfortable saying he didn't take responsibility for his play, because I think he did when he was playing. But you didn't hear him come out and say when he got benched, it's in the best interest. I understand why coach is making this decision. It might be in the best interest of this team for Jalen to start right now, and I'm going to support him in every way I can, and then go actually do that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That didn't happen. So that's the part of this where you've got to, and I saw Darius Leonard tweeting to free agents and saying, if you want to come here, you need to be ready to work. We need to want you too. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that popped into my head when this happened is they've got a good thing going. You've got to convince those guys that you are bought into what they're trying to do and that you're not trying to change what they have, because this is Darius Leonard's team.
And it should,
from an emotional sort of leadership who we're looking to stand.
Right. And that continued to be true even when Phillip Rivers, who is widely considered, one of the best quarterbacks to not make it to the Super Bowl of all time, he comes in. And it's still no question whose team it is and who the emotional leader of this team, when nobody is more emotional on the football field than Phillip Rivers, right? That's right, because it maybe not scares me, but it rubs me the wrong way that what Carson Wentz communicated last year was that his success individually was more important than what was best for the Eagles.
Bingo.
And that's, which is right. It's very much an easier said than done thing, because being a MVP caliber quarterback and then just 3 years later being benched is a tough pill to swallow. And I can't act like I know what it's like to try to swallow that pill. But,
and I think sorry to cut you off. I just want to
go ahead.
And I think he has acknowledged as much that this is something he struggles with.
Sure. He
hasn't sort of shied away from that, but it also has continued to pop up, which is a concern.
Right. And that's right. To Darius Leonard's tweet, that's the kind of thing that he needs to go to Indy and prove that's not going to be an issue.
Yep.
Because the great thing about the Indy culture, that football team, is that everybody on that team, at least all the important parts of that team, started in Indy, right? There aren't a lot of transplants and guys that, Darius Leonard drafted by the Colts, Jonathan Taylor, Michael Pittman,
Quentin Nelson,
you're right, and that front line as well. All of those guys started in Indy, are still in Indy, were once upon a time not the most important football players in Indy. Now they're the most important football players in Indy. So when you're coming in, even when you're the quarterback, it's your job to come in and make sure that remains true, and that you're not trying to overstep boundaries, which is a weird thing to say for a quarterback, but in this case, I think it's true. Chris, what are your stats?
My stat, it's not super. It's Wentz is a part of it, but it's not. It's sort of a bigger picture thing.
Sure.
There were between 2009 and 2016, 22 quarterbacks that were drafted in the first round. Not a single one of those quarterbacks is still with the team that drafted them. Between 2009 and 2016, we've got Matthew Stafford, Cam Newton, Blaine Gabbert, Robert Griffin III, Blake Bortles, Teddy Bridgewater, Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota, Jared Goff. Those are just the ones that are on new teams. There's also a handful that's retired. Mark Sanchez, Sam Bradford, Tim Tebow.
Oh, that's
not
a
a
tough
single one of these.
It's
a rough stretch. You got Johnny Manziel. You've got.
Hey, the
Andy
weekends are
Luck,
my
of
time.
course.
Me and Johnny Manziel, the weekends are my time. Still the favorite thing. That's my favorite thing that a pro athlete has ever said. Plays on Sundays, but the weekends are his time.
Weekends. So yeah, no bigger takeaway than that. It's just sort of just like amazing, like that string of quarterbacks for 7 seasons of first round quarterback picks. Not a single one is where they started.
And that right there is, we've talked about this some, and Josh and I specifically have talked about this idea of drafting a quarterback in the first round when, right, clearly drafting a quarterback in the first round isn't all that it turns out to be. Clearly, at least not most of the time, right? And we, because we were talking about, I'd much rather get a guy that I know is proven rather than going out and trying to get a guy like who's the North Dakota guy, Trey Lance. Right, all of those guys were more established college quarterbacks than Trey Lance is, and none of them. It's just an interesting conversation about the most important position in football, and just the unpredictability of the draft in general, right? I mean, the greatest quarterback of all time was drafted in the 6th round, so but right, you would think it is a little crazy to think about that. There could have been a 2009 quarterback that by this time is no longer with his team because he got old and was traded, right? But not even that isn't the case. And yeah, it's an interesting conversation about how hard it is to find a franchise quarterback. And I think that flies under the radar a little bit because Tom Brady just has won a third of the Super Bowls since the year 2000. So it's almost not as, it's not as loud and not as highlighted as much because all we can talk about, right? Because we had Peyton Manning in the last 20 years and we had Tom Brady in the last 20 years. Those are 2 all-time great quarterbacks, and of course Brady is far and away the best ever. But apart from those 2 guys, I mean, those 2 guys have won 9. Rodgers has 1. Wilson has 1. There are just a ton of teams that haven't gotten anywhere close, and a lot of that can be translated back to the fact that they just haven't been able to find a quarterback anytime recently, at least not one that they're riding with for 15 years.
That is the era I point to when I make the argument about not understanding why 5 teams draft quarterbacks in the first round every year. Because basically the only 2 quarterbacks that come to the top of my head off of that time frame are Russell Wilson and Dak Prescott. Right? There's this gap between the Drew Brees, Tom Brady, Phillip Rivers era, ending with Matthew Stafford. That's a wide range, I'm aware. And the Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson era that started with Wentz and Goff. Right after that, because I think Watson and Mahomes were both 2017 the next year.
I believe so.
Right in between there, you basically have only a couple franchise quarterbacks that got drafted. There's just nothing.
Yeah.
And of course, they were both not drafted in the first round, which is what makes that stat possible. But the flip side is, because Josh and I did this the other day because we were kind of curious, if you go look at who the starting quarterbacks are, most of them are still first round draft picks.
Yeah.
It's not like you can go find a quarterback later either.
Right.
You're kind of stuck. That there's justification for still picking these guys in the first round, but also a lot of them don't work out.
Right.
It's a strange thing.
Coming up next.
You could almost use.
Go ahead.
I was
go
just
ahead.
to say you could almost make that argument to say like, well, when you're the Colts and you are in a situation where you're not going to get a good draft pick and you don't know when the next time you're going to get a great draft pick is. I guess let's go with the guy who's shown he could be great in the past because that's risky, but there's risk in the other approach as well. But that's all. That's
and
all
it just doesn't take much for it to be way more than worth it, right? He doesn't have to be incredible for it to be way more than worth what they gave up for him. And it's an interesting thought experiment to talk about what you would have had to give up to get Carson Wentz after the 2016-17 season. Right, what would you have had to give up? Or even after the 2018 season, what would you have had to give up to get Carson Wentz? And now we're talking about a couple picks that, if he's just good, is more than justification. Coming up next, we're going to do Humor Me Please, and then best and most interesting games of the weekend. After that, you're watching 110 Daily on the 110 Sports Network.